Good morning and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. After a pause last week for our Mission Sunday, we're continuing our series on Abraham and we're picking up his story again in Genesis chapter 18. To recap, so far in our series, we've looked at how God called Abraham into the unknown and promised to bless him and his descendants, and how Abraham responded in faith and obedience to God's call. Yet we've seen that despite taking such a tremendous step of faith, Abraham then messed up and got things wrong. First, when he pretended that Sarah was his sister, not his wife, when they travelled into Egypt, and then when his wife Sarah got impatient with waiting for God to give her a son and told Abraham to have a child with her slave Hagar instead. And we saw a couple of weeks ago how wrong that all went. But we've also seen how each time Abraham got things wrong, God has stepped into the story, sorted things out and reaffirmed his promises to Abraham, as well as meeting so beautifully with Hagar when she was running away from Sarah, prompting Hagar to give Yahweh the name, "You are the God who sees me." And in our passage today, we once again see that God is the God who sees us and draws near to his people. The particular focus of today's passage is, I think, Sarah. God sees her in her pain and meets with her at the point of need. And as we journey through this passage together, we're going to focus on 4 P's: presence, provision, promise and power. So first, presence. God shows up. Despite the mess Abraham and Sarah have made of things with Hagar, in chapter 17 we learn that God appeared to Abraham again and renewed his covenant with him, repeating again his promise to Abraham that Sarah would bear him a son. Even though by this point, according to the narrative, Abraham is 99 years old and Sarah is about 90. So such a promise must have seemed even more impossible than when God first made it to Abraham, back in chapter 12. We don't know whether Abraham told Sarah all the details of this, his latest encounter with God, and God's renewed promise of an heir through her or not. But possibly not, given what happens in today's passage. Abraham perhaps chose to keep it to himself, not wanting to get Sarah's hopes up falsely yet again. After all, we read in chapter 17 that Abraham laughed when God told him this. And then in chapter 18, our passage for today, God shows up again and comes to dinner. We read in verse 1, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day." The word used here for the Lord is Yahweh, indicating that this was God himself who was appearing to Abraham in human form, as one of the 3 visitors. And it's been suggested by some scholars that this might even have been a Christophany, a pre-incarnation Jesus accompanied by 2 angels. But there's nothing to suggest that Abraham knew this at this stage. Though as the passage progresses, it must have dawned on Abraham that these were certainly no ordinary visitors. Mamre, the place where our story today is set, is the place where years earlier Abraham had built an altar to God after he'd separated from Lot. But it seems that when God appeared to him in Genesis 18, Abraham was just sitting, resting in the heat of the day. It doesn't say he was worshipping at the altar, praying or actively seeking God in any way. Yet the God who sees us chose to come near anyway, to be present, first to Abraham and then to Sarah herself, in the ordinariness of their daily lives. And we read in verse 2 that Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Abraham looked up and noticed the men. Now at this point, having noticed them, Abraham had a choice to make. He could have chosen to pretend he hadn't seen them, and so ignore them and carry on resting. It was the heat of the day after all. Or he could go over and greet them. But Abraham didn't just go over to them or wait for them to approach him. We read in verse 3 that he hurried over to them, despite his age and the heat, and then when he reached them, he bowed low to the ground before offering hospitality to them. Was there something about these men that made Abraham respond in this way? Did he sense even at the start that there was something special about these three visitors? Or was this simply the way he welcomed everyone who came near his tent? Either way, I think his attitude and actions present a challenge to us. Would we notice? Would we notice if God drew near to us in the ordinariness of our daily lives, rather than we're actively seeking him in prayer or worship, for example? Would we recognise if God came near to us in the form of someone else, someone who was in need? Would we sense God's presence with us? Or would we be too busy with everything we're doing to even look up and notice, let alone respond? Are we too inward looking rather than outward looking? How many God encounters might we have missed because we've been too focused on our work, on our social activities, or our phones, for example, catching up on the news or our social media feeds? How open are we to God's presence with us, to God meeting us, drawing near to us and speaking to us in the ordinariness of our daily life? And if we do notice, what do we do about it? We, like Abraham, each have a choice to make when this happens. When we sense that inner nudge or prompt telling us this might be God at work, do we respond by acting on it? Or do we choose to ignore it because it doesn't fit with our plans? Or do we just allow it to be drowned out by the busyness of everything else that's going on in our lives? How open are we to the voice of holy interruption? And how willing are we to act on it? One of the things we reflected on during our Practicing the Way series in the autumn was how available are we to others and how interruptible are we? Because in order to see God at work, sometimes we need to be both available and interruptible. If we're not, then we may never know where such holy interruption might have led us. We are the ones who miss out on the blessing of having been part of what God is doing. It could have been you, but you weren't paying attention. You weren't willing to make yourself available. So you are the one who misses out. Take the story of the two disciples on the Emmaus Road, for example. While they were walking along together, God drew near to them. But like Abraham with the three visitors, they didn't know it was God in the form of the risen Jesus who accompanied them that day. And they might never have known this if they hadn't chosen to extend hospitality to this stranger who had joined them on their journey when they arrived at the destination by urging him strongly to stay with them. They were no doubt tired after all that they'd been through. They could so easily have just let this stranger go on his way, rather than being willing to go to the effort of extending hospitality to him. Yet if they had done this, and hadn't urged him so strongly to stay with them, they would have missed out on the wonderful revelation that occurred to them when this stranger broke bread with them, and their eyes were opened to see that it was the risen Jesus himself. Again and again in the Bible, God chooses to draw near to and meet with people in the ordinariness of their daily lives. From Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush while he was out with his flock, to the angels who appeared to the shepherds at night, and to Jesus' calling of the first disciples when they were out with their boats getting on with the business of fishing. Think how different the lives of each of these people would have been if they hadn't been open to God interrupting them in the midst of the ordinariness of their daily lives. Are we open to God's presence? To God drawing near to us in this way? Are we open to hearing his voice even when it's a whisper or comes from an unexpected source? Recognizing that sometimes God might want to meet with us simply to draw near to us or to help us notice or delight in something seemingly insignificant. I love the story that Pete Gregg shares of the time he was walking along the road and suddenly sensed God saying very clearly to him, "Look at that tree." Pete shares how he instantly thought that something really significant must be about to happen with the tree, how it was going to be his burning bush moment. But literally nothing happened as he stopped and stared at the tree. He shares that he said to God eventually, I'm looking at the tree. What happens now? Then he sensed God say to him, why do you get so intense about everything? I just thought it was a really good tree. God wants to draw near to us and meet with us, to bless us through seemingly trivial encounters as well as much more significant ones. Are we open to that? Are we up for that? This brings us on to our second P, provision, and Abraham's radical hospitality to the visitors. Because thankfully Abraham was both available to and interruptible by his three visitors, even though he didn't realise at first at least that they were divine. And more than that, he provided for them by extending radically generous hospitality to them. Even by Middle Eastern standards, Abraham's eagerness to entertain his visitors extended to more than the ordinary politeness he might show to strangers. Even the low bow with which he initially greeted them was a sign of particular honour to his guests. Perhaps he instinctively sensed at first sight that there was something special about these three visitors. He addresses them respectfully and offers them water and a place to rest, before he then hurries off to make arrangements for some very extravagant catering for just three visitors, instructing Sarah to use large quantities of the finest flour and personally selecting a tender calf, a whole calf, to be prepared for them before serving them himself. He didn't just leave the work involved in offering hospitality to his servants, and he did all this at speed in the heat of the day when he would normally have been resting. Abraham not only made himself available to these strangers, the hospitality he provided for them was generous, extravagant, enthusiastic, costly to him, and involved significant effort on his part. What about us? Can the same be said of the hospitality we offer to others, including to strangers? As this passage illustrates, and as we're reminded in Hebrews chapter 13, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. How willing are we not only to be available and interruptible and open to God meeting with us in the ordinariness of our daily lives, but also to being radically generous in our hospitality to others, to follow Abraham's example and to follow Jesus' example too in this, and to be actively welcoming to others, to make those we meet feel loved, wanted and valued by providing for them. Do we treat all those we encounter with love, respect and generosity? Of course, this might not always involve preparing a lavish feast for them. It could simply be providing a listening ear over a cup of coffee, being generous with our time and heart rather than our culinary skills. But it does mean being open to the needs of those we encounter and responding to people with love and kindness when we can, because when we do this, it is Christ we're serving. As Jesus said in his parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew chapter 25, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will ask him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Yet the story of Mary and Martha illustrates that although we are to seek to offer generous hospitality to others, Jesus doesn't want all the preparations involved to become a stress or the main focus. Rather, we are to remember why we are offering that hospitality in the first place. And that's not always easy, because it's all too easy to get distracted, as Martha did, by all the practicalities of what needs doing, and then to be too busy or tired to enjoy the company of those we are offering that hospitality to. And we never know what might happen as a result of showing such hospitality in all its various forms to others, including to strangers. Even doing something as simple as paying it forward in a coffee shop by paying for an extra meal or coffee, for example, for the staff to then offer to someone else. We may never know what impact such a simple act of generosity might have on the one who receives it. And then we come to our third P, promise, and Sarah's encounter with God, the heart of this whole passage. Because in the passage we're looking at today, once the 3 visitors have been welcomed and so generously served and fed, we finally learn the real reason for their visit. It seems that they had in fact come for Sarah's benefit, not Abraham's on this occasion, to make God's promise of a son to her in person. We read in verse 9, "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." They knew who she was, and they knew her by name. They knew her by name. If they were complete strangers just passing by, how did they know Sarah's name? And how did they know that she was now Sarah, not Sarai? Only God and Abraham knew of her name change given in the previous chapter. If Abraham hadn't already guessed, this question must surely have made him, if not Sarah, realise there was something special about these 3 men, that at the very least they must be messengers of God. The visitors must also have known that Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent. You get the feeling that the conversation with Abraham was really for her benefit. Abraham has already had several first-hand encounters with God, but Sarah hasn't. The promise of a son is being reaffirmed here just for her. Although she will have heard all about God's promises second-hand from Abraham, this is the first time that Sarah has heard the plan from God with her own ears. It's the first time that she has had her own encounter with God, albeit while listening in from the entranceway of her tent. Wonderfully, God has chosen to come in human form, to be present to Sarah, to meet with her, and to make his promise to her in person. But perhaps not surprisingly given the circumstances, Sarah doesn't respond with total faith and acceptance when she hears this. We read in verse 12, "Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, 'After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?'" That's how Sarah saw herself. She was too old, too worn out, long past the age of any possibility of childbearing, to think that she could ever be worthy of such pleasure, of the things she had longed for so many years. All the years of childlessness, followed by yet more years of waiting, even after hearing of God's original promise to Abraham, had left Sarah feeling not surprisingly somewhat doubtful and cynical. So she laughed to herself when she heard God's words. And to be fair to Sarah, even Abraham had laughed and questioned God when God had reiterated the same promise to him back in chapter 17. Sarah is likely guarding herself against yet more disappointment. And I'm guessing God knew this. He knew just how low Sarah was feeling, that she had lost all hope. And so he chose beautifully to draw near to her, not just to Abraham, to restore Sarah's faith and hope in the promise he had made to her and Abraham. God then hears Sarah's laughter and challenging them both by asking, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Or as one translation puts it, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" Is anything too hard or wonderful for the Lord? Before God reiterates his promise with a specific timescale, this child will be born next year. There will be no more years of waiting. But Sarah perhaps still hasn't grasped that this is God himself who has come to her, the one who knows us each intimately, who knows our thoughts before they're on our lips. God himself is speaking to her, but she hasn't grasped. And so she denies the fact she laughed. Sarah was afraid. So she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But God gently rebukes her by saying, "Yes, you did laugh." Because there is no fooling God about how we are feeling or thinking. He knows. And yet we still try to hide our true feelings from him at times. I wonder how this encounter made Sarah feel. Did it help her to realise that the one she was speaking with was indeed divine? Did it give her renewed hope and the ability to once again hold on to God's promise to her? Was this the revelation that God knew she needed? Her own encounter with him, so she no longer had to take Abraham's word for it, or to live through his experience of God, because she had now had her own. She had met God herself. What about us? We too need to hold on to God's promises to us. And in order to be able to truly do that, we need to have our own encounters with God. We have to reach a point where we each make our faith our own because of our own relationship with God and with his precious Son, Jesus. We cannot rely on someone else's faith and experience of God, no matter how deep or strong their relationship with God might be. We need our own. We need our own relationship with the living God. And if that's not true of you yet, then why not talk to God and ask him to meet with you today? And be open to him doing this in unexpected ways. If you're not sure how to do this, then have a chat with one of the team or someone else who you feel comfortable talking to. But even if we do have a living relationship with God, based on our own experiences of him, we too can get despondent when God seems absent or our life isn't going to plan. And we, like Sarah, may seek to guard ourselves against further disappointment by choosing not to believe or have faith that God might come through miraculously for us. If that's how we feel, we can take comfort from the fact that just as God knew Sarah and even seemingly understood her reticence, God knows us too. God knows you. And he will meet you where you're at and deal with you where you are. But in this, we also need to continue to remind ourselves who God is and what he has promised us. And that, as the angel Gabriel was to say to a young unmarried virgin many centuries later, nothing is impossible with God. And that brings us on to our final point. Power, that God has the power to fulfill his promises. God is far greater than Sarah has yet grasped. And if we skip ahead to chapter 21, we learn that now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. God did indeed have the power to make the seemingly impossible possible. God does. And Sarah's cynical laughter was turned into joyful laughter. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Her utter despair has turned to deep joy. In response to the question, is anything too hard or wonderful for the Lord? Our answer has to be no. Nothing is too hard for the one who created all things. God is able to do the seemingly impossible because he is God. We shouldn't limit God by putting him in a box and deciding what he is and is not able to do. As we read in Ephesians 3, he is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. If we set human limits on what God can do and say, that some things are too hard for him, then we are not allowing God to be God. But having said that, although God can do what seems impossible to us, as he did for Abraham and Sarah, that does not mean we should expect that he always will. God did the seemingly impossible for Abraham and Sarah because he had promised them specifically that this was what he would do. It was part of his bigger plan for his people. This is not the same as saying that God will do the impossible just because we might want him to do something seemingly impossible, no matter how much we might want him to. And I think this is really hard for us to grasp, and even harder for us to accept. When God doesn't step into the situations in our lives that we so desperately want him to, that we know he has the power to do, and yet he doesn't. And there are no easy answers to this. There are no easy answers. But we can trust. We can trust that God will keep any promises he has made to us. even if it's in his timing, not ours. So we've looked at our 4 Ps. We've looked at presence, when God shows up. We've looked at provision and Abraham's radical hospitality. We've looked at promise, Sarah's encounter with God and his promise to her. And we've looked at power, how God has the power to fulfill his promises. I wonder which of those 4 things you most need to take away with you today. Do you need to be more open to God showing up in the ordinariness of your daily life? To notice and respond? Do you need to be more radically hospitable to others, to strangers as well as to friends? Do you need to encounter God for yourself for the first time? Or do you need to help someone else do this? Or do you need to remember that nothing is too wonderful for the Lord, and we need to let God be God? Amen.